The year was 1971. Rome, a city steeped in history and faith, pulsed with a disquieting undercurrent. It was a time of fervent political unrest, a clash of ideologies that seemed to mirror a deeper, more sinister conflict brewing in the shadows. Father Brennan, a man with eyes that had seen too much and a heart that carried the weight of unspoken dread, was growing increasingly desperate. His frantic pleas to Father Harris about a clandestine occult conspiracy had been met with veiled warnings and a cryptic photograph, a picture of a baby, seemingly innocent, but marked with a name that sent shivers down the spine: Sinner. Harris, a man of deep conviction, had tried to unveil the insidious secrets festering within the church, only to be silenced in the most brutal way. A pipe, dislodged from a construction scaffold near a sacred place of worship, had plummeted, crushing his skull with a sickening thud. The sight was horrific, a macabre prelude to the terrors that would soon unfold, a sign that those who dared delve too deep into the forbidden were destined for an agonizing end. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in the United States, a young woman named Margaret Daino, a novice nun with a naive heart and unwavering faith, prepared for her journey to Rome. She was a soul yet untouched by the darkness, and the promise of devotion and service beckoned her. She was full of hope and a fervent desire to serve God. She had no idea that her destiny was already intertwined with a web of ancient evil and forbidden rituals. The Visidelli orphanage became her new home, a place where she would begin her journey into the abyss. The orphanage, cloaked in an unsettling quiet, was an eerie place. Cardinal Lawrence, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold eyes, greeted her with cordiality. Father Gabriel, with his quiet demeanor and unsettling gaze, and Abbess Silva, a figure who commanded an unnerving authority, were also among those who welcomed her. Sister Angelica, with her hollowed eyes, and Luz, a fellow novice whose cheerfulness was unnerving in this setting, completed the strange group. It was a place where faith seemed to cower beneath the weight of unspoken secrets. Luz, in an attempt to befriend Margaret, dragged her to a local disco, a haven of flashing lights and throbbing music. In this vibrant yet alien setting, Margaret met two men. She found herself drawn to a man named Paolo. As they danced, a strange dizziness washed over her, and everything faded into black. When she awoke the next day, she found no memory of the night's events. It was as if a veil of darkness had been pulled over her mind, concealing the horror that had transpired. She tried to piece the fragments of the night, but it was an exercise in futility. The encounter had been tainted with an evil she did not understand. Amid the unsettling atmosphere of the orphanage, Margaret encountered a young orphan named Carlita. The child was withdrawn, haunted by visions that made her tremble with terror. She was constantly tormented by horrific visions, her eyes filled with a knowledge far beyond her years. Margaret, drawn to the child's suffering, developed a bond with her. Father Brennan, his face etched with worry and warning, came to Margaret, warning her about Carlita, claiming that evil things would soon take place. He knew too much about the darkness lurking beneath the surface, and he feared for the naive nun and the dark role she was about to play. One fateful day, Margaret witnessed Carlita showing Sister Angelica a disturbing drawing, a depiction of a pregnant woman being restrained. The scene was horrifying, a premonition of the dark rituals to come. Mere moments later, Sister Angelica was consumed by a macabre blaze, her body hanging grotesquely from the rafters, a ghastly spectacle of a death most foul. This terrifying event would send chills down the spine, making the reality all the more shocking. The flames had consumed her, and she was no more. It was a brutal message, an omen of the horrors that awaited. Brennan, driven by his grim knowledge of the occult conspiracy, revealed the truth to Margaret. Radical elements within the church, desperate to regain power against the surge of secularism, were plotting to bring about the birth of the Antichrist. They sought to restore fear and dominance by plunging the world into chaos and despair. The very foundations of faith were being perverted by those who had sworn to protect them. He went on to explain that Carlita was to be the mother, chosen for this unspeakable role. Margaret was horrified, but her horror was about to grow exponentially. During a chaotic field trip, a riot erupted, and Margaret experienced a demonic hallucination, a glimpse into the abyss of madness. It was an assault on her senses, a vision that shattered her reality. The very air vibrated with malevolent energy, and she was confronted by the faces of unspeakable horror. It was a glimpse into the true nature of the evil that was lurking around her. Abbess Silva, now seemingly more sinister, used the chaos to postpone Margaret's vows and command that she distance herself from Carlita. It was a sinister plan, an attempt to manipulate the pawns in this horrific game. She had no idea of the depths of the depravity that were about to befall her. The powers that were manipulating her were far greater than she could fathom. In her despair, Margaret encountered Paolo, the man from the disco. His face was twisted with horror, a stark contrast to the alluring smile from their first meeting. He tried to warn her, frantically telling her to look for the mark before a truck brutally slammed into him, his body mangled by the impact. His death was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of violence, a grim warning to anyone who dared expose their insidious scheme. The clues were starting to accumulate. Margaret, with a growing sense of dread, began to investigate. In the abbess's office, she uncovered a hidden chamber below ground. It was a place of unspeakable horror, filled with subject files labeled Cyana. They contained photos of disfigured babies, each bearing a mark of 3 sixes. Carlita was the only one who had survived to adolescence. It was a gruesome revelation that linked the orphanage to an unholy experiment, an attempt to breed the spawn of the devil. Margaret, now fully aware of the impending danger, attempted to flee with Carlita, but she was intercepted. She then saw the mark on Carlita's palate. It was the same mark on all the babies in the files. Before she could react, she was imprisoned. The dark forces were closing in on her, and she was trapped. But Father Gabriel, a man whose conscience still stirred, managed to free Margaret. She, Brennan, and Gabriel examined the stolen files, discovering that there was another survivor. They realized that this was not just about Carlita. Then Margaret discovered the mark of 3 sixes, on her own scalp. It was a horrifying revelation. She was not just a pawn, but a key player in this demonic game. She suddenly recalled the night at the disco. She had been brutally violated in a satanic ritual, impregnated by the spawn of darkness. The pieces began to fit into the horrifying puzzle. The realization was terrifying. The orphanage heads believed the devil would need to mate with his own spawn in order to conceive the Antichrist, and Margaret had been brought to Rome because Carlita was still too young. She was not just a victim, but a vessel. Her body was now a battleground between good and evil. It was a nightmare unfolding before her very eyes. They raced to find a doctor who could abort the demonic pregnancy, but their vehicle was struck by another car. It was no accident. The force of the crash incapacitated everyone but Margaret. Then, to her horror, her body swelled, her belly bulging grotesquely with the demonic life that had taken root within her. She felt herself being consumed from within as her pregnancy accelerated at an unnatural rate, and she knew the birth was going to be something out of the depths of hell. She woke strapped to a hospital bed, greeted by the sinister smile of Cardinal Lawrence, the head of the conspiracy. The room was filled with men and women, their faces twisted with a combination of perverted awe and wicked delight as she was subjected to the most unspeakable of horrors. This is what it had all been leading up to. The unholy birth was upon them. As Margaret writhed in agony, her body tearing apart from the unnatural process, she gave birth to 2 children, a girl and a boy. It was the boy, her son, who was hailed as the Antichrist. His arrival was celebrated with a macabre glee that was sickening to witness, a perverse ritual that heralded the dawn of a new age of darkness. The conspirators, revealed to be Luz and the man who had been with Paolo at the disco, celebrated their victory. It was a betrayal beyond words, a corruption of innocence so complete that it felt like the very universe was weeping. The world was now in the clutches of pure evil. Margaret, in her anguish, stabbed Cardinal Lawrence, but she could not kill her own son. The love that binds a mother to her child, no matter how evil, was too strong to overcome. She knew that the child was the spawn of the devil, and yet she could not bring herself to kill it. Luz, without a hint of mercy, then stabbed Margaret before the conspirators fled, setting the chamber ablaze to cover their tracks. This was the final act of depravity, a complete descent into the realms of hell. Just as the inferno began to consume the room, Carlita, a child who had been so traumatized, appeared like an angel in her hour of despair and saved Margaret and her daughter. And amid the flames, Margaret saw a demonic jackal shrieking in the fire. The inferno seemed to crack open and release something from the bowels of hell. It was a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The baby boy was secretly given to Robert Thorne, an American diplomat, to replace his wife Catherine's supposed miscarried child. It was a dark deception, an act of treachery that would have far-reaching and devastating consequences, a horror story that was just beginning. The Antichrist was now hidden away in a seemingly normal family, ready to begin his reign. Years passed. Margaret, now scarred and broken, lived in seclusion in the mountains with Carlita and her daughter. Together, they had become a semblance of a family, bound by the shared horror of what had transpired. But their peace was precarious, a fragile bubble in the sea of chaos. One day, Father Brennan, still haunted by the shadows he had tried to unveil, visited Margaret. He brought with him terrible news: the conspirators were still hunting her, and her son had been named Damien. He was now a pawn in the game of evil, a living incarnation of everything that was unholy. His birth was no longer a secret. The hounds of hell were loose, and he was about to ascend his throne of evil. Margaret knew that their sanctuary was not safe. The darkness would not rest, it would hunt them until their dying breath. The world was about to bear witness to a new chapter of terror, and she and her family were at the center of it. And she had given birth to the catalyst of this unholy madness. The horror had just begun, the mark of the beast. The years that followed were a dark and unsettling passage of time. Damien, the child of darkness, grew with disturbing speed, displaying an uncanny intelligence and an eerie magnetism. His presence brought an unspoken unease, a chilling sense of foreboding that clung to those around him. His eyes, cold and piercing, seemed to possess a depth of ancient knowledge, a silent testament to the malevolent force that resided within him. Damien's adopted parents, the Thornes, were oblivious to the sinister truth of his origins, blinded by a love and devotion that made them vulnerable to the growing evil that surrounded them. The diplomatic life they led was no longer just politics. It was now a pawn in a game far more dangerous and far more sinister. The shadows were growing darker with each passing day. Robert Thorne, now a prominent figure in the political world, unknowingly nurtured the very evil that threatened to unravel civilization. He was completely oblivious to the true nature of his adopted son, too blinded by the joy of fatherhood to see the dark patterns that began to emerge around him. He was raising the Antichrist, but he thought he was raising his son. Catherine Thorne, a woman of beauty and grace, grew increasingly unsettled by the strange occurrences surrounding Damien. Her sleep became riddled with horrific visions, and her waking hours became tormented by an unexplained sense of dread. She knew that something was terribly wrong. She felt like she was going crazy, but she knew her sense of impending doom was real. The signs were subtle at first. Inexplicable accidents, a sudden drop in temperature in his presence, a strange aversion to religious iconography. The family pets turned violent, and those who dared to question the boy's strange behavior met with unfortunate ends. These were not mere coincidences. These were the telltale signs of evil, the harbingers of hell. The world was beginning to succumb to the darkness. A wave of inexplicable suicides seemed to be following in the wake of Damien. People would lose their minds, their faces would contort with fear, and they would end their own lives in the most gruesome ways. It was a disturbing trend, and it was a sign that the world was beginning to fray at the seams. The idyllic life of the Thorne family began to unravel into a tapestry of terror. The love that had once bound them was starting to turn into something more sinister. The very foundations of their family were starting to crumble. It was not just them, though. It was the world around them. Margaret, hidden away in the remote mountains, had nightmares of Damien. She could feel his presence, like a malevolent shadow that lingered just beyond the veil of sleep. She knew that her life was still in danger, and she knew that one day she would have to confront the monster that she brought into this world. She lived with a deep-seated fear that she would have to sacrifice herself to stop the evil. Carlita, ever the silent guardian, remained at her side, their bond forged in the fires of shared trauma. She would sometimes see flashes of things to come, her visions becoming more ominous and her face more grim. The weight of the world was upon her young shoulders, and she knew the battle that awaited her. Brennan, consumed by his quest for redemption, tirelessly searched for a way to stop Damien, spending countless nights deciphering ancient texts, desperately seeking a solution to this unholy problem. He understood the gravity of the situation, and he knew that time was running out. He was a man possessed, trying to stop the end of the world. He discovered prophecies, warnings etched into the fabric of time, detailing the rise of the Antichrist and the ensuing chaos. He read about the mark of the beast, the signs that would indicate the one who would plunge the world into an age of darkness. He had to be the one to stop the darkness, even if it meant his own destruction. He realized that Damien was not just a child. He was an abomination, a demonic entity clothed in human flesh, set to unleash unparalleled horror upon the world. He knew this because of the mark he had, and the strange things that seemed to surround him. He was the Antichrist, and the world would fall prey to him soon. Driven by a fervent and desperate belief, Brennan sought an audience with high-ranking officials within the church, but they were deaf to his warnings, their minds clouded by power and arrogance, unable to grasp the true extent of the danger. He was dismissed as an old fool, a madman who had lost his grip on reality. They could not see the storm gathering on the horizon. The church, once a beacon of hope, was now fractured from within, its leadership corrupted by the same forces that had birthed Damien. Their eyes were blind to the evil that was growing, their hearts were hard, their souls had already been bought by the darkness. Meanwhile, Damien, oblivious to the machinations around him, continued his rise, his every step marked by an unholy aura, a growing feeling of power and domination. The world was beginning to fall in line, unaware that it was succumbing to the very evil that it feared. He was not just a child. He was the embodiment of the darkness itself, a force of chaos and destruction. He knew it, and he reveled in it. He could feel the power coursing through his veins, and he knew that he was destined for greatness. The greatness of evil. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together, converging towards an inevitable and terrible climax. The ancient prophecies, the demonic rituals, the unholy lineage, all pointed to a single, horrific truth. The age of darkness was about to descend upon the world. The reign of the Antichrist was beginning. Margaret, realizing that she could no longer hide, knew that she had to confront the evil she had birthed. Her daughter's safety and the future of the world depended on it. She felt a deep sadness, but also a growing resolve. The time had come for her to face her destiny. Carlita, standing by her side, was a silent promise of vengeance, her eyes filled with the knowledge of the horrors to come. She had seen the future, and she knew the sacrifices that would be required. The world was in great peril, and the time had come for the warriors of light to stand tall. The descent into darkness. As the world edged closer to the brink of chaos, Margaret emerged from her seclusion, her resolve tempered by the fire of her past suffering. She was no longer the naive novice who had arrived in Rome years ago. She was now a warrior of light, driven by the fierce protection of her daughter, and a desperate hope to stop the unholy reign of her son. Her search for answers led her to the forgotten corners of the world, delving into the mysteries of ancient lore. She went through the grimiest, most depraved places on earth, hoping to find something that could help her. She learned about the nature of demonic forces and the ways to counteract them. She had to be the one to save the world, and she would not fail. Margaret, Carlita, and Brennan embarked on a dangerous quest, a journey through a landscape of fear and deception, trying to find the key to stopping Damien. Every step they took was fraught with peril. They faced not just physical danger, but also the ever-present threat of demonic influence. Robert Thorne, finally beginning to grasp the horrifying truth about Damien, was torn between his love for his son and the realization that the boy was a dangerous entity. He was struggling to reconcile his love for his son with his growing knowledge of the evil that was surrounding them. His perfect world had become a nightmarish landscape. He sought answers, but the truth was a cruel mistress, leading him further into the clutches of the conspiracy. The political powers that he so trusted were now his biggest enemies. He was trapped, but his love for his family kept him going. Catherine Thorne, plagued by visions and driven to the edge of sanity, started to see Damien for who he truly was, an evil force masquerading as her son. Her love began to transform into abject fear. She was a prisoner in her own home, watching her family be consumed by the darkness. She was desperate to protect herself and the people around her. Her world was unraveling before her very eyes, and she was helpless to stop it. She began to lose faith in everything that she once believed. The world watched in growing apprehension as Damien's influence began to spread like a plague, infecting the highest echelons of power and the most vulnerable corners of society. He was everywhere, and his presence was turning everything to chaos. His followers, drawn by his charisma and unholy power, committed acts of unspeakable violence, spreading chaos and fear in his name. The world was descending into an age of terror, and they were all dancing to the tune of evil. The church, once a symbol of hope, was now a fractured and corrupted entity, unable to offer any resistance to the growing darkness. The leaders had sold their souls to the very evil that they had sworn to fight against. They were now his strongest supporters. Margaret, with the help of Brennan and Carlita, sought to expose the conspiracy and to reveal the true nature of the Antichrist. She was fighting against the very powers that were controlling the world. It was a hopeless fight, but she had no other choice. They faced insurmountable odds, facing off against a malevolent force that had been centuries in the making. Every step they took was an act of defiance. They were not going to surrender to the darkness. They would fight until their dying breath. But Damien's powers grew, twisting the fabric of reality around them. He was beginning to bend the world to his will, and there was nothing that anyone could do to stop him. The very air was now thick with menace. The lines between good and evil blurred, and the world teetered on the edge of complete annihilation. The time was running out, and the very fabric of reality was starting to fray. Hope was becoming a distant and elusive dream. Margaret knew that she had to make a final stand. She would have to confront Damien. She knew that the world was relying on her to save them all. She had to sacrifice herself to put an end to his reign of evil. Carlita, her loyal companion, stood by her side, ready to face her destiny. Her visions had become clearer now, and she knew exactly what she had to do. She would stand with Margaret until the very end. Brennan, a warrior of faith, was prepared to fight until his last breath, his eyes burning with determination. He was not going to let the darkness win. He would stand tall against evil and bring about its demise. Together, they faced the embodiment of evil, the child of darkness, the Antichrist who had been destined to plunge the world into an abyss of terror. They were ready for the final battle. Their souls were on fire with the passion of faith. The final confrontation. The final confrontation took place in a location that was once holy, now defiled by the encroaching darkness. The air was thick with tension, vibrating with an unnatural energy. The stage was set for the final act of this horrific drama. Damien, now a young man, stood tall and arrogant, his eyes burning with a malevolent fire. He seemed to radiate pure evil, a beacon of darkness that threatened to consume everything around him. He was ready to claim his place as the ruler of the world. His followers, a collection of the most corrupt and depraved members of humanity, watched in anticipation, their faces twisted with a strange blend of fear and adoration. They had placed their faith in the Antichrist, and they were ready to follow him to the depths of hell. Margaret, her heart filled with both love and determination, faced her son, the creature of darkness she had brought into the world. She knew she would have to be the one to stop him, even if it cost her everything. Carlita stood by her side, her eyes locked on Damien, her resolve unwavering, her spirit unbent by the weight of what was about to transpire. She was the guardian of the light, a force of nature ready to unleash her wrath on the forces of evil. Brennan, his face weathered and his eyes filled with faith, held a relic, a symbol of hope and the divine power that had been granted to him to face this evil. He was a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. He knew that he was the chosen one. The battle that followed was not just a physical confrontation. It was a clash between the forces of light and darkness, a struggle for the very soul of humanity. It was a fight to end all fights. Damien unleashed his power, his demonic energy twisting reality, creating chaos and terror around them. The world began to crumble under the weight of his dark powers. All seemed lost. Margaret fought back, her love for her daughter, and the desire to stop her son fueling her every move. She fought with a passion and conviction that surprised even her. She had never felt so powerful. She had to win. Carlita, guided by her visions, released an ancient power, a force that had been sleeping since the dawn of time. She became the embodiment of light, her pure energy slicing through the darkness. She was a warrior sent by the heavens. Brennan, his faith unwavering, wielded the relic, invoking the power of the divine, striking back against the demonic forces with an unmatched fervor. His soul was on fire. He was fighting with the power of the heavens behind him. The battle raged, shaking the foundations of the world, the balance of power constantly shifting, good and evil locked in a desperate struggle for supremacy. It was as if the very universe was holding its breath to see what would become of them all. In the end, it was Margaret who delivered the final blow, making the ultimate sacrifice, using her love for her child as a weapon against his evil. She had to stop him, even if it meant her own destruction. It was the only way. Damien, weakened and defeated, fell, his dark powers dissipating, his unholy aura fading into nothingness. The reign of the Antichrist was over. The world was safe. Margaret, mortally wounded, fell into Carlita's arms, her last act one of love, her final sacrifice a testament to the enduring power of goodness. She had given everything to save the world. She had given her life to stop the darkness. Carlita, her heart broken, but her resolve firm, stood tall, a beacon of light in the aftermath of the darkness. She was the new guardian, and she would make sure that the darkness would never rise again. Brennan, exhausted but victorious, looked upon the remnants of the battle, knowing that while the war had been won, the darkness would always be lurking, waiting to strike when the world was most vulnerable. He knew that the battle was never truly over. And as the dust settled, and the world began to heal, the memory of the fallen, the sacrifices that had been made, the courage that had been shown, would remain etched into the very fabric of the world. The horror had ended, but the scars would remain. The world had been saved, and it would never forget. The end of the world had been averted by the actions of a mother's love, a young orphan's vision, and the unwavering faith of a warrior of God. The world had been given a second chance.